Hello, Create Schools. Today I'm going to talk about the USA Depth Study. We're going to look at who did not benefit from the economic boom and the Roaring Twenties. So this video goes in conjunction with the other two videos. The other two videos talk about all the good things, and this time I'm going to talk about the bad things. Because remember, it's important to know both sides of the story. It's not always one way. There are always two sides of a coin. So please go ahead and get out a piece of paper and pen and go ahead and write these notes down. And I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, first I want to take a look at African Americans. They faced a lot of racism and discrimination in the 1920s. Although they won freedom from slavery in 1860s, they were still very discriminated against. It was particularly bad in the South, where thousands of black Americans were murdered by lynching in this period, and I'll explain lynching in the next slide. And as a result, many African Americans moved to the North, where everything was a little bit better, but it wasn't all that great. So the black population in both Chicago and New York doubled in the 1920s. There was a lot of segregation, where I have my segregation pictures here. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. Water fountains for colored people only, and there was a color waiting room. So the discrimination wasn't just African Americans. It was also all ethnic groups that weren't basically white looking. I'll go into that also a little bit more in the next slide. There was some chance of getting a better education and a better paid job in the North. Also, a lot of famous musicians, especially in the jazz musician, were very famous and important. Louis Armstrong is the most famous jazz musician. That was covered in the other slide about the Roaring Twenties. And two famous black Americans that were really into political movement was W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the NAACP, the National Association of American Colored People, and Marcus Garvey. He founded the UNIA. I'm sorry, I don't know what the UNIA stands for, but that is also another black business, black Americans organization. Despite all the improvements, the life expectancy was lower for African Americans than white Americans. Lots of discrimination, and there was extreme poverty, and there was also a lot of blacks who were forced to live in ghettos. So go ahead and pause here and take these notes down. Then I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, one of the things that was really making it really bad for black Americans was the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And it was formed in the 1850s, 1860s, just after the American Civil War. And they would do a lot of parades, they would beat people up, they would lynch, and other violent methods to imitate black people. Sorry about that typo right there, guys. That R belongs there, not there. Here is lynching, basically hanging a person. But the KKK did not just attack black Americans, they attacked Jewish Americans, Catholics, and other immigrants. Basically, if you were not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant person, they would attack you. So Anglo-Saxon being white. Basically, if you weren't a white Protestant person, they could attack you. The KKK was strongest in the Midwest and the rural South, and they had 4.5 million members by 1924. And scarily enough, there were some prominent members of the KKK who were in political position, which helped them put laws and things through. Also, I wanted to point out the burning of the cross. They did a lot of this. The video of the American 21st Century Timeline that I always have you guys watch, that's in your classroom, goes a lot into the KKK, and you can learn a lot about it from that one. Also good to note, in 1925 it started to go into decline, but scarily or unfortunately in the late 50s it started going back up again in popularity. Go ahead and pause the video here, and I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, I've kind of already talked about poor women when I talked about the Roaring Twenties. I felt that I needed to talk a little bit about how not every woman prospered. But again, not every woman could lead that flapper lifestyle that was mentioned in the other video. Most of them have been working for a long time already, because one of the things I talked about is how women got more money, and so therefore they wanted more to support themselves. But if a woman had already been working to support her family, she didn't gain more independence by working. She actually stayed the same. And there was a lot of people that didn't share in the freedoms that the middle class women enjoyed in this time. So poor women farmers. I've got farmers here. I've got people that were maids and things. And also we've got the workers. A lot of them could not enjoy the wonderful flapper lifestyle. And I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so pause here and take those notes, and I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, Native Americans were also discriminated against. The numbers declined from 1.5 million to 250,000 in the 1920s, so there was a lot less Native Americans, and their traditional way of life was being taken away from them. They were forced to live on reservations in extreme poverty and had lower life expectancy. Many had poor health, poor education, and low-paid jobs. There was even an attempt to get out the Native American ideals from the children, and so they would send the children of Native Americans to boarding school to make sure they learn good traditional American cultures and destroy any ideas or concepts of the Native Americans. It was actually quite horrific. But in the 1920s, there was some more turning points towards the end. In 1924, they were granted U.S. citizenship and given the right to vote. And then in the 1930s, it got even better. And so slowly the life was getting better and better after the horrific things that we'd done to Native Americans in the 1800s. And even before the 1800s. Pause here and take these notes, and I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this goes along with the economic boom. Old industry suffered. The cotton suffered. A lot of people stopped using cotton. They started using rayon and nylon. And so the flappers also needed less fabric for their clothing. So as the clothing got smaller, less fabric was needed and less cotton was needed. And so the people who picked cotton, that suffered. Also coal was replaced by oil and electricity. And with new machinery for the assembly lines, some old industries lost workers. Now in the other video I was explaining how there was more workers that were needed to run the assembly lines, but they didn't need to be so specified. But for other industries, the assembly line in the factories and the things were able to replace the workers, such as here when women were making cloth, if you have an automatic weaver, then you don't need a person to weave. Also with the cutting and the sewing and things like that. So unemployment became a huge problem in areas that the old industries were going away and people were losing money. So that is one of the big downsides of the economic boom. Go ahead and pause here and take notes. I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, farmers were one of the people that were hugely affected in the 1920s. So if you remember, farmers were making a lot of money during World War I because they were producing a lot of goods for World War I, for the people to fight in World War I. So a lot of people turned to farming so they could make money, and then they bought land and property. But then when World War I ended, there was a massive amount of overproduction. They didn't need to sell their things overseas because the people overseas in Europe could provide for their own goods. Also with their import taxes that were placed on the goods coming to America, explained in the first video, those other countries were placing import taxes on our goods, which totally makes sense, and so they were not able to export. They couldn't compete in the exports, so they were not able to export their stuff. Also, on the flip side, the Canadian wheat farmers, even with the import taxes, their prices were so low that the Canadian wheat farmers were able to undercut the American wheat farmers' production, and even farmers that were producing wheat in America could not sell the their wheat. Also, with prohibition, they didn't need as much wheat because they didn't need the wheat to produce the alcohol anymore. So the unskilled labor started to rise in rural areas. A lot of workers and farms were laid off. A lot of farmers had lost their farms, and their houses were foreclosed, and there were basically a lot of poor people. So these poor people started moving to the city to look for more work in the city. So farms were very hard cut in 1920s, and a perfect example how the Republican policies did not help. Okay, pause here and take these notes, and I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, at the same time all of this is going on, the Red Scare was happening. And the Red Scare, we all know, red is communism. So if the Red Scare is the fear of communism. In 1917, that is when Russia became communist. This you can also look on the Chapter 2 videos, and I believe also the Chapter 4 videos explain this a lot more if you need any more information. And America was very scared in the 1970s, starting communism, that communism would infiltrate the United States and people would want to become communist. So a lot of immigrants, especially Russian immigrants, were suspected of being communists and anarchists. Anarchist is a person against the government, which actually doesn't quite make sense, because if you're Russian, you wouldn't actually be moving to America to escape communism. You would be, and bring communism, you would be moving to America to escape communism. So their whole ideas were kind of, the fear did not allow them to think clearly. Okay, so any workers that were involved in strikes and trade union, they were accused of being communist. And the Americans were strongly into the idea of the American dream. And the American dream celebrated and encouraged capitalism and the pursuit of wealth. And so communism is 100% against the American dream. So anytime there was any crimes done by immigrants, they would harshly punish them and say this is, this was anti-communism, or this was communism, anti-American, and that we need to punish those crimes. So there was one huge trial known as Sacco and Vanzetti, and this has actually come up on a 4-point test. So I don't know if it'll come up on a 4-point test again, but you need to really know about this. This is a perfect example of the Red Scare. These are 2 Italian immigrants, and they were anarchists, but they were not communists, and they were found guilty of armed robbery and murder. And they basically went through this trial, and they had tons of witnesses saying that it wasn't them, they didn't do it, they didn't cause it, but the courts were so wanting to punish them because they were anarchists. They said, nope, it was them, and they were executed in 1927. Later, we found out they are definitely not the murderers. In 1925, before their execution, the actual murderer came forward and gave himself up, but they just didn't want to believe him because they really wanted to set an example with Sacco and Vanzetti. Later on, 30s or 40s, they were later pardoned for their crimes, but by then they were already dead. But at least the families know, and everyone in the world knows, that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent of the murders. So that's the Red Scare for you. So go ahead and take these notes down. If you have any questions, let me know. But I'm going to go on to the next slide. So with the Red Scare, there was a huge problem with immigration. So all immigrants, everyone from America were immigrants. Because if you weren't an American immigrant, then you were a Native American, and then you were also persecuted against or discriminated. But like I said, most Americans were WASPs, and that is White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which basically white people from England and Protestant, or from Germany or Sweden, but they're wealthy countries. But in 1890, more immigrants started from Eastern Europe and Asia, so from some of the poorer countries. And the demands were growing. Even more people wanted to immigrate, and so America wanted to slow down the amount of immigration, and they set up these laws. An immigration law, first, required all immigrants to prove they can read English, not just read, but read English. And they banned all immigrants from Asia, and they charged an immigration fee of $8, and that was a lot of money back then. Then they had an Emergency Quota Act, that stated the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere could not be more than 3% of the number already in the Americas. So they limited the number. That's what this number is. So you can only be 3% more of all of the numbers. It said a maximum year of immigration in any year of 357,000 people. And then finally in 24 it changed that maximum number to 154,000, and it changed the quota from the Eastern Hemisphere to 2%, down from 3%. So they made it even less people. And the people from South and East Europe were only allowed 20,000 immigrants per year. So the immigration was greatly made smaller, and less people could immigrate to the United States each year. Okay, I'm sorry, forgot to tell you to pause here and take these notes down. So those immigration laws, you don't need to know the specifics, but you do need to understand as time goes by, less and less people were allowed to immigrate to the United States. And I'll move on to the next slide. So the monkey trials, the John Scopes trials, I find this very interesting, and again that the video, the American Timeline, this does an excellent review of it, so watch it and it'll tell you a lot. But basically what happened is, so people were teaching evolution in schools, and suddenly they decide, oh, we don't want to teach evolution anymore. That is, evolution is the people come from monkeys, that should be banned. And quite a few states said, no, we can't teach evolution anymore. So John Scopes was a teacher of biology in I'm sorry, totally blanked what state he's from. But so he was a teacher in biology, and he decided he was going to put the law on trial, and he was going to go ahead and teach very blatantly that, the creationism, that we come from monkeys. And he did that so he could be put on trial, and he could make an even bigger public stink about what is going on. And so when the trial happened, there was huge, lots of things, like you'd see the monkey dressed up in a suit. They had other things. It was all over TV, and everyone knew what was going on. Now, of course, Scopes lost, but his fine was so small that he had to pay, I believe it was $1 that he had to pay, that it was quite embarrassing to the fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists are the people who wanted to take away teaching of creationism. And so the fundamentalists lost a lot of power, and basically it was very embarrassing for them. So I believe that's the last slide. Yes, so this is your last slide. I hope you are able to understand anything. If you have everything, if you have any questions, please let me know.